The hallway smelled like disinfectant and old paint, the kind of smell that never really leaves a police station. It was late, past midnight, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the linoleum floor. Somewhere down the corridor, a door slammed. Somewhere else, a phone rang and went unanswered. On the floor of a modest apartment building in Waukegan, Illinois, an 11-year-old girl lay dead. Her name was Holly Staker. She had been babysitting her younger siblings while her parents worked the late shift. It was supposed to be a normal night. Cartoons on TV, pajamas, bedtime stories. Instead, just after midnight, Holly's mother returned home to a silence that felt wrong. Too heavy. Too still. Holly was found in the bathtub. The water was cold. The air was thick with fear and disbelief. The apartment showed signs of a struggle, but no forced entry. Whoever did this hadn't smashed their way in. They had either been let inside or already knew the place. Word spread fast. A child murdered in her own home sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Squad cars lined the street, their red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. Neighbors stood outside in bathrobes and hoodies, whispering theories before the sun even rose. Inside, detectives moved carefully, photographing every inch of the crime scene. Fibers, footprints, a partial palm print near the tub, blood where it shouldn't have been, and most importantly, biological evidence, evidence that could speak when witnesses could not. The pressure to solve the case was immediate and relentless. Parents demanded answers. The media demanded a suspect. And the police department knew one thing for sure. If they didn't find someone fast, fear would swallow the town whole. That's when they turned their attention to Juan Rivera. Juan was 19 years old. Quiet. Socially awkward. He had a low IQ and struggled to understand complex questions, especially under stress. He lived not far from Holly's apartment. To detectives, that was close enough. They brought him in for questioning. At first, Juan denied everything. He said he didn't know Holly. He said he'd never been inside the apartment. He said he had nothing to do with the crime. His voice was shaky, his answers uncertain, but denial was denial. The interrogation didn't stop. Hour 1 passed, then hour 3, then hour 6. The room was small, windowless, and designed to make time feel meaningless. Detectives came and went. Their tone shifted, sometimes calm and reassuring, sometimes sharp and intimidating. They told Juan they had evidence. They told him witnesses had seen him. They told him this was his chance to explain himself. He wasn't offered a lawyer. He wasn't given a break long enough to clear his head. 9 hours in, Juan was exhausted, confused, desperate to make the questioning end. And then he confessed. He told them he had entered the apartment. He told them he had attacked Holly. He described details that made detectives exchange quick glances. This was it, they thought. The case was over. A confession. In the world of criminal investigations, a confession is gold. It silences doubt. It satisfies fear. It gives the public a name to blame. Juan Rivera was charged with murder. The headlines came fast and brutal. A young girl murdered. A suspect arrested. Justice moving forward. The town exhaled, believing the danger had passed. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Juan's confession didn't match everything at the scene. Some details were vague. Others were flat out wrong. He got the layout of the apartment wrong. He described events that forensic evidence didn't support. Still, prosecutors pressed on. At trial, the confession took center stage. Jurors heard how Juan had admitted guilt after hours of questioning. They were told confessions don't come from nowhere. They were shown selective pieces of evidence that pointed in one direction, and one direction only. Juan was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. As the prison gates closed behind him, Juan insisted he was innocent. His words echoed into the void, unheard and unwanted. To the system, the case was closed. To the public, justice had been served. But evidence has a way of waiting. Years passed. Behind concrete walls and steel bars, Juan aged faster than he should have. Meanwhile, science moved forward. DNA testing, once primitive, now precise, offered a chance to re-examine the truth. Eventually, the biological evidence from Holly Staker's case was tested. The results were undeniable. The DNA did not belong to Juan Rivera. Not on the victim. Not at the scene. Not anywhere it mattered. The very evidence that should have sealed the case now tore it wide open. If Juan's DNA wasn't there, whose was it? Prosecutors fought to keep the conviction. Appeals were denied. Retrials came and went. Each time, Juan faced the same nightmare. A system unwilling to admit it might be wrong. Then, during one review of the case, something surfaced, something buried deep in the original investigation. A detail that suggested detectives may have known, even early on, that the physical evidence didn't line up with the confession. And when that information finally reached the light, everything changed. Because if the confession was false, and the DNA proved it, then the real killer had never been caught. And that meant Holly Staker's murderer might still be out there. By the time Juan Rivera's DNA results came back, the truth should have shattered the case instantly. Instead, it barely made a crack. The laboratory report was clear, clinical, impossible to misread. The semen recovered from Holly Staker's body did not belong to Juan Rivera. The blood at the scene did not belong to him either. The palm print lifted from the bathtub was someone else's. In a crime built almost entirely on a confession, the science was screaming that the confession was wrong. But the system does not like to admit mistakes, especially big ones. Prosecutors argued that the DNA evidence was inconclusive. They suggested that one could have committed the crime without leaving his DNA behind. They leaned hard on the confession, repeating the same line again and again. People don't confess to crimes they didn't commit. One listened to all of this from a prison jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his future shrinking with every word. Behind the scenes, his defense team dug deeper into the interrogation itself. What actually happened in that room during those 9 hours? What was said when the tape recorder was off? What promises were made? What threats were implied? The answers were unsettling. Juan had been questioned without a lawyer present. He was young, intellectually limited, and eager to please authority figures. Detectives used leading questions, fed him details, and corrected him when he got things wrong. Over time, the story stopped being Juan's memory and started becoming something constructed, piece by piece, by the people questioning him. Psychologists call it false confession contamination. To Juan, it felt like drowning. Every appeal brought new hope and new disappointment. One conviction was overturned, only for prosecutors to retry him. Another jury heard the same confession, framed the same way, and still convicted him again. Each time, the DNA evidence was minimized, explained away, or buried under legal technicalities. Outside the courtroom, Holly Staker's family was trapped in their own nightmare. They wanted justice. They wanted certainty. Every retrial reopened wounds that never healed. They were told, repeatedly, that Juan Rivera was responsible. To question that meant questioning everything they had been promised. Years turned into decades. Juan spent over 20 years behind bars for a crime the evidence said he did not commit. Then something shifted. Advances in DNA technology allowed for more precise testing. This time, the results were not just exclusionary, they were definitive. The DNA profile belonged to an unknown male, and it was consistent across multiple pieces of evidence. There was no ambiguity left. Juan Rivera could not have been the perpetrator. The appellate court could no longer ignore it. In a ruling that quietly acknowledged the failure without fully naming it, the court overturned Juan's conviction. The charges were dismissed. After more than 2 decades, Juan Rivera walked out of prison a free man. The cameras were there when he stepped into the daylight. His hair was gray now. His face carried the weight of years stolen from him. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, blinking against the sun, trying to understand how the world had kept moving without him. Freedom, it turned out, was complicated. Juan received compensation for the years he lost, but no amount of money could give him back his youth. Jobs were hard to find. Trust was harder. The label of former murderer clung to him in ways that paperwork couldn't erase. And then there was the question no one wanted to answer. If Juan didn't kill Holly Staker, who did? The DNA profile sat in a national database, waiting for a match that never came. Leads dried up. Witnesses had moved away or passed on. Memories faded. The crime scene itself existed only in photographs and reports. The truth was brutal in its simplicity. While the system focused on the wrong man, the real killer had years, decades, to disappear. Some investigators quietly admitted what went wrong. Others refused to comment at all. Officially, no one was held accountable for the wrongful conviction. No detectives were disciplined. No prosecutors faced consequences. The system corrected the error, then closed ranks. For Juan, that silence was almost as painful as the prison walls. He spoke publicly about false confessions, about the dangers of interrogation tactics, about how easily fear can override facts. His voice was calm, but beneath it was something sharper, a warning. Because his case wasn't unique. Across the country, other inmates watched his release and wondered if the same truth might exist in their own files, buried under paperwork and pride. Juan Rivera became a symbol of both hope and failure, proof that innocence could be proven, and proof that it could take a lifetime. Yet one piece of the story remained unresolved. Years after Juan's release, a retired investigator revisited the case privately. Going through old notes, overlooked tips, and witness statements that never made it to trial, he noticed something disturbing. A name mentioned briefly early in the investigation. A person of interest who had been dismissed once Juan confessed. Someone whose alibi was never fully verified. Someone whose DNA had never been tested. When this information surfaced, it raised a chilling possibility. What if the answer had been there all along? Ignored, overshadowed by a confession that made the case easy. What if the real killer had been hiding in plain sight, protected not by intelligence or luck, but by the system's refusal to question itself? Because if that was true, then Juan Rivera wasn't just a victim of a wrongful conviction. He was the key to a much darker truth. And the closer investigators came to reopening that door, the more dangerous it became to ask what, or who, might be waiting on the other side. The name resurfaced quietly, almost by accident. It appeared in a stack of yellowed police notes, buried beneath decades of filings and crossed-out leads. A man who lived less than a mile from the Staker apartment. A man with a history of violent behavior. A man who had been questioned briefly in the earliest days of the investigation, and then forgotten the moment when Rivera confessed. His name had been convenient to forget. When Juan's confession landed, the case stopped being a mystery. The pressure lifted. The headlines were written. The community was told the danger was gone, and that man's file was slid into a drawer that no one opened again. Until now. The retired investigator who found the notes didn't have official authority anymore, but he had something just as dangerous. Time, and a conscience that wouldn't let the past stay buried. He reached out to journalists, innocence advocates, and former colleagues. Some refused to talk. Others listened in silence, unwilling to put their names on the record. One detail stood out above all else. The unknown DNA profile recovered from Holly Staker's body had never been compared to this man, because at the time, his DNA was not in the system. Years later, after unrelated arrests, it was. The match was never officially announced. Not because it didn't exist, but because no one reopened the case to look for it. When journalists began asking questions, the response from authorities was cautious, almost scripted. The case, they said, was closed. There was insufficient evidence to pursue new charges. Too much time had passed. Witnesses were gone. Memories unreliable. Justice, they implied, had already done all it could. Juan Rivera watched these developments from a small apartment, far from the prison cell that had once defined his entire world. He had learned not to expect closure. Freedom had taught him that the truth doesn't always bring peace. It often brings new wounds. He agreed to one final interview. Sitting under harsh studio lights, Juan spoke slowly, choosing each word like it might be taken from him if he wasn't careful. He talked about the interrogation room, about how exhaustion blurred reality, about how authority figures became impossible to contradict when you are young, scared, and desperate to go home. "I didn't lie," he said quietly. "I was convinced." That sentence haunted everyone who heard it, because it revealed the most terrifying part of the case. One hadn't been beaten into confessing. He hadn't been threatened outright. He had been guided, shaped, and slowly led to believe that the only way out was to agree with a story that wasn't true. The system hadn't just failed him. It had trained him to fail himself. Advocacy groups used Juan's story to push for reform: mandatory recording of entire interrogations, limits on questioning minors and vulnerable suspects, stronger reliance on forensic evidence over confessions. Some changes were made. Others stalled in legislation, debated until the urgency faded. As for Holly Staker, her name became part of a different tragedy. Her family had been told for years that the man responsible was punished. Learning that this might not be true reopened a pain they had never agreed to relive. They were caught between anger, grief, and a justice system that seemed incapable of giving them certainty. No one won. The suspected alternative suspect died quietly years later, never charged, never publicly accused. With him went the possibility of a trial, a verdict, or a definitive answer. The DNA profile remains on record, a silent witness to a crime that officially has no perpetrator. And that may be the most disturbing part of all. Juan Rivera was innocent, but the case itself remains unresolved. A confession destroyed one life. A refusal to admit error protected another. And somewhere between those two facts, the truth was lost. Today, Juan lives cautiously. He avoids crowds. He avoids police stations. He avoids anything that reminds him of locked doors and fluorescent lights. He speaks to law students and reform advocates, not because it heals him, but because he knows silence is what allows these stories to repeat. He often says that prison didn't end when he walked out. It just changed shape. And when people ask him what scares him most now, his answer is simple: that it's still happening. Because somewhere, right now, another young person is sitting in an interrogation room, tired, afraid, trusting the wrong people, believing that telling them what they want to hear will make it stop. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: the system doesn't always care if you're innocent, only that the case is closed. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, if it made you question how justice really works, then you're not ready to look away yet. There are more stories like this, some even darker. Make sure you subscribe, because the next one might be happening right now.